So we are live. This is my first ever CVS Live Guest, and I have today the honor of interviewing and chatting with Canadian Catholic. Welcome to the show, Canadian Catholic.
Yes, thanks for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm sorry for the technical issues we had with the first try, but this seems to be a lot better. And just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and acquaint the audience with your Catholicism and with your online presence.
Yes, I am currently a Roman Catholic. I was raised a non-denominational Christian, and through a journey, I deconverted and became an atheist. I was an atheist on and off for about 1 year. And then through study, through research, through thinking, I abandoned the position of atheism and started a journey that eventually led me to theism and Christianity more specifically. And from then on, it was a journey. It took some time, but I found myself more involved and more interested in the Catholic faith. And eventually, I happened to join it.
Can you maybe just tell the listeners a little bit about your childhood, how you were raised? I believe you were raised in some sort of Protestant young earth creationism. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was a non-denominational Christian, and I was raised a young earth creationist, and that was a big part of it. Basically,
Is there any sort of colorful story you could tell about your faith, the first memories you have of your faith, and when you first, as a thinking, rational being, decided that there is a God and I want to worship this God? Just talk a little bit about your first inklings that God and religion are real and worthy of your adherence.
Yes, in the beginning, it obviously came more naturally to me. It was something I was raised in, and something that was like kind of second nature to me, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, right? But over time, I started more thinking about it, and I got to the point where it was indefensible. I had the same doubts, but the point where I really started thinking about it, and when it was something I consciously thought about it, and not something that I was raised with, was probably around 18. And that's the time when I started going more deeper into the research, understanding historical context, listening to people, philosophical arguments, and stuff like that. So the point would be around when I was 18. So that would be the age, just to give you. And I spend a lot of time also debating and discussing on Reddit, particularly the subreddit Atheism and the subreddit Debate an Atheist. I eventually actually created my own subreddit once. And yeah, I had these discussions. So the discussions helped me grow. The more antagonistic the discussion, the more development I experienced.
And would you say philosophy is a major part of your conversion away from God and then back to God? Can you talk a little bit about the philosophical ideas that shaped your journey a little bit?
Yes, philosophy had a huge part, I would say, crucial part in it. Getting your philosophy right is the most important thing, right? And that's basically what happened. The philosophical argumentation, the framework is important to understanding basically everything related to this subject, especially theology. So that is really the most important part. Now, of course, there is a place for science, there is a place for history, there is a place for biology, for mathematics, all of it. But the primary framework, philosophy, is the most important subject when having these discussions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, again, the Catholic faith, really, when we're talking about Christianity, I hope you mean a more orthodox form of Christianity. Because if right now in Christianity you're including the Christians who are atheists but simply like the message of Jesus, right? Then that's a different conversation.
Yeah, I think I had my mute on there so the listeners couldn't hear the question. It was basically about what are the deal breakers to leave Christianity or Catholicism. So you can continue with your answer, but there are different deal breakers for me, and just sort of run through the gamut. What would it take for you to leave Catholicism and Christianity?
Yeah, when we're talking about Christianity, as I said, the issue obviously depends what kind do you mean. Because if under Christianity you simply mean the most generic form where someone can like believe in God but simply like the message of Jesus, then you could always be that. But if in Christianity you mean something much more specific, then that would have to be the orthodox form of Christianity, the right believing one. And historically and invariably, the Roman Catholic Church is the church that developed from that orthodox sect. So one would have to show me that that's wrong for me to leave Roman Catholicism as the most authentic expression of that right believing sect of Christianity that developed.
How would you characterize the authority of non-Catholics, whether they're atheists, Hindus, Jews, or Protestants? How would you characterize their understanding of authority? How do they speak with authority when they interpret the Bible or the Hindu religious texts or the atheistic secular scientific journals and all those sorts of things? What is it with authority in non-Catholic worldviews?
Actually, you would be surprised, but with a lot of more historical Protestants, and I'm not talking about the Protestants who are simply, you know, don't even have knowledge of their own faith in a historical context. With historically oriented Reformed Christians, they have space for authority there. They do understand a lot of what I say very intelligently. And the issue is ultimately, I would say that uh, more of these people are interested in actually learning about the Catholic faith, the more they and history, the more they actually adjust some of their language to better reflect the problems we have with it. So I've had discussions with Reformed Christians. You know, they are not at all the fundamentalist types who simply sit down and are not willing to listen to anything from history. They'll actually quote the church fathers. They'll be interested in, they'll present the more historical views. So yes, I think it's a good thing that they also have some sense of this, because ultimately, all religions have their origin from the fact that we have an innately imbued desire to communicate with the divine. And now, of course, humans have a way to anthropomorphize the divine. And that's why you get the differences in religions. Time goes by, a lot of anthropomorphisms get added. The features of God that are supposed to be non-anthropomorphic become more and more anthropomorphized. Then there is syncretism where religions mix with each other. And that's why, of course, you get so many different views. But it's important to distinguish, I think, anti-Catholic rhetoricians from various sects from the people from different religions who are willing to engage more honestly and actually study what historical Catholicism teaches.
Do you believe in an eternal hell? Because some Christians today don't, and some Christians in history didn't. What's your stance on an eternal, unending punishment and suffering in hell?
I mean, I accept the eternity of hell unless shown otherwise, but I keep my mind open to being shown otherwise. I'm pretty open-minded when it comes to people showing me, but my default position will be staying on the side of eternity.
Okay. What would you say separates a monist from a monotheist who does not believe in eternal hell? And by monist, I mean those of the Eastern religions, Hinduism, certain forms of Buddhism, where there is only God, and only heaven, and all separation is illusion. There is no eternal hell. What separates the monotheist who rejects eternal hell from the monist, please?
Yes. So now, when we're talking about something like this, the most important thing to understand is that the Eastern tradition is fundamentally different from our traditions that we are used to. In those Eastern religions, the religion is understood completely different. I've had talks with Hindus, and they were thinking in a completely different framework. For them, a lot of the religion is an expression of culture, of tradition, of ritual, rather than just rigid truth that they want to, explain to you. That's why you see that a lot of Eastern religions are non-proselytizing ones. And for us and for Muslims, this is a foreign concept. I mean, if you have the truth, you want to spread the truth, right? And for a lot of the Eastern traditions with religions like Hinduism, you see the almost complete absence of that mentality. What you see is an emphasis on tradition, on nationalism, and on keeping national religion. That is something that has to be taken. For me, basically, it's the tradition in which it developed. So the difference between a monist who lacks belief in eternal punishment and a monotheist is, of course, the tradition in which those beliefs develop.
I listened to your talk with Aron Ra, and I did enjoy it. I'd like you to talk a little bit about two atheists that I have some experience with. Aron Ra is one, and the other is Matt Dillahunty. I understand your interview with him was exciting, but I didn't have a chance to listen to it. Can you just talk a little bit about those two characters? Because they're very visible in the aggressively atheistic community. Can you just talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, so I'm well acquainted with both of them. Both of them were people I somewhat admired back in the day when I was deconverting, when I was an atheist and when I left atheism, right? And Aron Ra was always someone I probably had more experience and knowledge with. Before my interview, we had spoken before about various topics. We have chatted before over text. And Aron Ra is definitely a person I respect very much. He was and is one of my favorite atheist YouTubers. He definitely has a very entertaining way to talk and debate. And he is actually one of the biggest reasons why I now accept theistic evolution, even as a Catholic. Right? He really led me there. Now, when it comes to Matt Dillahunty, I think that he is also someone who is ultimately always willing to listen to you. But one quality I do not like is excessive swearing that is sometimes displayed, and sometimes a belittling of opponents. But otherwise, I think both of them are um, people that are more open-minded than you might think, right? So yes, I definitely have huge respect for them, but I disagree on some key issues.
Yeah, one of the main issues that I like to discuss with atheists is free will, and most self-respecting atheists today who have thought about it deny having free will. Can you talk a little bit about free will and monotheism versus atheism, just that sort of debate?
Yes, I mean, again, from an atheistic perspective, as much as people do not like using that terminology, free will really is something that is being abandoned. Dr. Daniel Dennett was really a pioneer in this thing, and yes, ultimately, from the perspective of metaphysical naturalism, free will is something that's an illusion, definitely, because your brain is simply a product of mechanical workings of the universe, no different than a river flowing down the stream. It really is an illusion. From a monotheistic perspective, that is harder to address because monotheism is a very rich and diverse tradition, right? And it would have to be more specific. But from an atheist perspective, it is totally logical for someone to abandon the whole notion of free will. Right? Dr. Daniel Dennett really pioneered this, and I think it's finding more and more acceptance now. There are still people who address this issue. I must give credit to Mr. Dan Barker, who is the Freedom from Religion Foundation, who actually did write a book about this and did talk about the diverse tradition of philosophers who have taken, who have given us their positions on it. He talked about like St. Thomas Aquinas, but really it is going down that road. Yes, it's finding more acceptance among the atheist community. that free will is entirely an illusion. And I think it is totally compatible with the framework under which the atheists operate.
Were you a hard determinist as an atheist?
Not really. I wouldn't put it myself that way. When I was an atheist, I spent most of my time using an Occam's razor as my argument. So I wouldn't argue for my position. I would attack another person's position. When I started applying skepticism to my own position, that's when the thing started changing. Right? So, yeah.
I'd like to, because we're talking about free will and atheism. Another approach I like to take with atheists is the beginning of everything that is, and I guess you could label this as sort of a contingency argument for the existence of the first cause, the uncaused first cause, and it's one of my favorite proofs of the existence of God, who is infinite in every perfection. But that idea sort of segues nicely into theistic evolution versus creationism. Can you just sort of give your reasoning of why you reject young Earth creationism, especially since you were raised with it ostensibly? And what are the best arguments for the Big Bang and the singularity? How do you explain the singularity and stuff like that? And or are you just having God create that singularity?
So the first correction that I like to make is that evolution is not every field of science that conflicts with young Earth creationism. When we're talking about the theory of evolution, specifically what we're describing is the diversity of species. Right? So the Big Bang is not under the theory of evolution. It's the field of cosmology. What deals with the theory of evolution is biology. So what changed my mind is basically that as Christians, we believe that God reveals himself also through nature and evidence. And so we can't merely disregard evidence. I think the evidence is important in determining and changing our minds. And I think evidence is sufficient to say that the Earth is not 6,000 years old. And more importantly, evidence is sufficient to say that Genesis, the first books, were not written as ornithology textbooks, right? They were not written to be seen from our perspective and just to be analyzed as normal history textbooks. They are written as a narrative to give a theological point. So in Psalm 138, when David says, "You wonderfully knit me in my womb," all of us understand that this was not meant to be an embryology. This is just a poetic, beautiful description of how thankful David is. So Genesis incorporates a narrative that was very common around that time and around that place to illustrate points more easily, and of course set symbolic precedent. On the seventh day, God rests, so Israelites have to rest on the seventh day too. It's really a beautiful allegory sort of thing that was intended for theological reasons. And of course, it's infallible. I mean, people assume when I take such an approach that I'm saying that there are mistakes in the Bible. Of course not. I believe Genesis is infallible. But infallible as what? I believe that the book of Job is infallible, but not infallible as a textbook for repairing cars, right? I believe it's infallible for the purposes it was written, which is theology and equipping Christians to better understand their faith.
Do you have difficulty reconciling some of the dogmas of the Catholic Church with your theistic evolution? For example, it is a dogma, a defined dogma, an explicit dogma, that the soul, the human soul, is the form of the human body. So that seems like an insurmountable stumbling block for anyone that wants to engage in theistic evolution. And there are other dogmas, formally defined dogmas,
no,
such
not
as
really. I don't. Not really. I don't. I accept that the human soul was not something that evolved, but was specially created. So, I accept that the humans in their physical form did undergo a process of development, but God imbued them with a soul. But I don't really claim to know all that much about it. I simply take what the Roman Catholic Church has historically taught, along with the evidence that we have.
Yeah, so can you paint a little picture? I'd like to understand how you see the timeline of God having created a good world. That's a dogma of the church, that he created a good world and that there was no evil in that world until sin. So can you paint a little timeline for me of the perfect world that God created? And that means a perfect universe, all of space-time. it was perfect until sin. Can you paint a little timeline of when the first human came on the scene with respect to, thorns and thistles and disease and death and that sort of thing, and the 6 days of creation, please?
Yeah, well, this is, again, something that I do not take a rigid doctrine on. You could obviously argue about the pre-Adamites. So that, for example, that when we're talking about a perfect world or something, what we mean is that there was a specific time in evolutionary history when God, for example, gave human beings the perfect condition to live in, and this is what was being talked about. There are obviously other explanations for it, which has been had. I do not take a rigid stance on that specific one. I accept as dogma that the Genesis represents something that has a historical context behind it. So I do accept that there was a literal Adam figure, of course. I accept that. But I don't accept the ones that we conflict with science, that the Catholic Church itself has given us freedom on. For example, if you've read Pope's famous encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, where he discusses the theory of evolution. That's pretty much, I think, that was a very groundbreaking encyclical that is worth looking at and seeing what the Church permits us.
Yeah, there's certainly a permission to examine both sides of the question of material development of the body of Adam, the first man. But I really want to get back to the timeline. Do you deny that God created a perfect universe? Do you think that there was death and disease before Adam fell? And if not, then just paint a little picture of that timeline. How did the perfect creation look before Adam fell and then after Adam fell, and about what time in history, in geological time, according to you, did that take place?
Yeah, no, I do not take a rigid stance on that at all. No, I don't personally. And what we have to accept is, of course, the dogmatic teaching of the Church and reconcile it with the scientific evidence. But as far as the knowledge goes, if I can paint a picture of something that is not available, then no, I cannot do that, because the historical record would be incomplete for me to do that and to argue for what the perfect world would look like or what would be. I definitely believe that there was a time in history where humans disobeyed God, and for that they incurred punishment and the doctrine of the original sin. But I cannot go beyond what the Scripture teaches us more allegorically and accepting evidence for origins of the human race.
Okay, I want you to talk a little bit about Adam's birth. Was he conceived in the womb of some sort of primate or humanoid or whatever they call it?
No, I do not take that stance at all. I think Adam was a fully human Homo sapiens that was that lived, and his description in the Bible is again based on actual historical event. Now, again, as I said, the books of the Bible, as Bishop Aron would say, the Bible itself is a library. So you can't go into a library and say, is this library allegorical or is this library literal, right? There are different genres, and the genre of Genesis is mostly narrative genre. So narrative is not just allegory. It might contain cores of historicity, but mostly it incorporates this historicity to give a larger picture of what I wanted to see theologically. Right, and this is exactly what I would say. I accept that there is a historical event about humans disobeying God, a primordial event, but I don't take that Genesis was written as being history. I don't believe that even was the intent of the authors of Genesis. That's actually as far as I do.
Yeah, I'd like to avoid, if you would just indulge me, avoid talking about Genesis and the Bible, if you would please. Just talk about what your Catholic faith consists of in terms of Adam, okay? And then we can get to Eve later. But just with Adam, you're saying that he was an adult, fully formed adult when he was created by God. Did I understand you correctly?
Well, yes, I personally accept that Adam existed as a historical figure. He was part of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. I'm open to the idea that Adam did not have parents but God made him, but I do not accept that Adam, for example, was the first ever creature to live or something like that. I do not means to describe actual history, right? Or perhaps if you don't want to talk about Genesis.
Yeah, I just want to avoid talking about the Bible because it's completely, it really is to me completely beside the point. I just want to get an idea of the story and the timeline. But you've made it sound like you're reluctant to put Adam in the womb of some sort of ape and have him be born and then be transformed by the infusion of the human form, which is what would necessarily have to happen according to the Catholic dogma, that the human soul is the form of the body. So as soon as he has his human soul, he has to have a human body, not an ape body, not any sort of lower primate body, but a human body. So at some point, so it would seem that you reject the idea that he was formed in the womb of some sort of ape. Is that true?
Yeah, so the key issue to understanding is that from a biological perspective, we're all apes, including me and you, right? I mean, they're really, from a taxonomic stance, there is no real difference. Of course, humans are not simply descendants of apes, humans are apes, right? But that is beside the point. I do not believe that. I'm open to hearing different arguments. I do not take a dogmatic stance one way or the other. The dogmatic things are important to define and accept, and the things that are not undefined, I leave undefined, and I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded to the idea that God created Adam without human parents, without precedent. I'm open-minded to that. Let's, for example, accept what is dogmatically defined. And
okay. Usually I like to talk about Eve being formed from the side of Adam. There's a long tradition, and it was almost enshrined as infallible doctrine in the First Vatican Council, but it was I think it was in the first draft or the second draft of a document that was going to be published and propagated, but the Franco-Prussian War or whatever it was broke out, so it didn't come to fruition. So I don't have an actual dogma defined that Eve was created from the side of Adam, but I do firmly believe it because that's the overwhelming consensus of the fathers and of tradition. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the church fathers, the important part to decide is not just what they believed, but the reasons for why they accepted it. And this again is a huge part of the Catholic faith, deciding why someone accepts something. If you go to more earlier fathers, right? But we forgive them, quote, forgive them. What we tolerate from them, we would not tolerate from today's fathers. For example, Origen was basically a declared heretic, yet still we use him as an authoritative figure in the church, simply because of how early he was in history and how undeveloped the doctrine was in terms of language, right? And this is actually has been a part of patristics, studying the patristics, why they accepted something. This is the important part. A lot of people, for example, in the early church would have accepted geocentrism too. We did not go back to geocentrism because we evaluate why they accepted something, and that's how we judge them. So the issue that the church fathers believed in the literal Genesis creation account is interesting, but it's also worth noting that there were a lot of church fathers that more generally tried to drive a separation between the realm of science and the realm of theology. And theology, of course, is interlinked with science, but there is a difference between them. And this is the difference that has to be emphasized. We also, as I said, have to account for the natural revelation, which we accept, that God reveals himself in nature. And when this revelation paints a unanimously different picture from what we accepted historically, then we have to reevaluate what we accept historically, because I'm telling you, I have a book on my shelf, facsimile of the Nuremberg Chronicles, that show the geocentric model of the universe, and that was accepted by a lot of churchmen, right? We do not go back to that because we evaluate the historical context of not only what they believed, but why they believed it. And when we look at it from that way, theistic evolution is something that is totally in line with Catholic tradition. Which I think, again, when we're talking about theistic evolution, we have to clarify, we have to accept dogmas, right? I accept that the universe was created ex nihilo. I accept that Adam historically existed. These are things that have been accepted by the church, And again, you'd have to convolute it a bit not to accept it. Now, again, I'm reluctant to call someone who does not accept Adam's literal existence a non-Catholic. I do not actually play that game, but it would be harder to argue because historically Adam has been defined as a historical figure. But as far as what the church permits, that is what I take, right? The church has permitted the acceptance of theistic evolution. It is totally in line with the
Well,
tradition.
we are warned not to treat theistic evolution as if it's an established fact, that it's a truth. We're warned that we have to submit to the church, and the church has a final decision. And it was merely a lot of these documents from the different popes were merely encouraging us to examine different sides of the question, just like with contraception, right? And then when the church finally spoke on contraception, a lot of people were disappointed and angered by the decision of the church. But I, for one, celebrate. I think it was it Humani Generis, or what was the name of that encyclical that Pope Saint Paul VI came out with?
Yeah, Venerable Paul VI.
So, I want to
Humani Vitae is what you were talking about.
Humani Vitae, excuse me. Yeah, thanks. The other one, Humani Generis, I think has to do with the evolution, the question of theistic evolution. There's another interesting series of questions to do with theistic evolution, and it stems back to this notion that there was a period of providence. We are now in the era of providence, but there was a period of creation, the first 6 days, whether those are 6 24-hour days or whatever, it doesn't really matter. The point is that there was this sort of distinct realm of time whereby a special creation dominated, and then of course God's providence takes over on day 7, and we see we can breed and interbreed with different types of dogs and get different explore different avenues like that. But it would seem that the theistic evolution is forced to say that natural processes took lower creatures and developed them into higher creatures. For example, the first life form, whatever it was probably small and relatively simple compared to a human being. The secular biologists have different opinions about what that first life form might have been. And I don't want to get into abiogenesis because it's ridiculous. It's another rabbit hole. But the notion that I'm focusing in on here is natural processes developing a lower life form into a higher life form. And there's the principle of proportionate causality, which says you can't give what you don't have. And so God alone can create a new higher species. And so it would seem that the theistic evolutionist is abandoning the principle of proportionate causality, without which we can't do science, and is abandoning this notion, this dogma that only God can create, because you have the natural world creating higher from lower, which is against the dogmatic teachings of the church. I
disagree with that. I think that's a totally inconsistent way to approach it, because I mean, under that framework, we have to also abandon the whole idea of human birth and development. I mean, in your womb, you developed from being a single cell zygote to being a multi-celled human being that you are now. Obviously, no one would ridiculously argue that that somehow violates any dogma of the church or any scientific principle. That's the same issue we have here, right? I mean, God used natural processes to develop the universe and the workings of the universe. And when we're talking about God, as Pope Francis warned us, we have to avoid taking a very primitive anthropomorphic principle where God is a cosmic painter and literally sits down with an invisible sponge. We have to see it from a more broader perspective. We see God as the cause, right? And the cause in our terms, because we do not have a sufficient term to describe what God did. We only use our analogies. So the best analogy would be a painter, right? This is the framework I take.
Okay. So is it safe to say that you believe that 13 point whatever billion years ago, everything was there, everything that was in its whatever configuration it had, all of matter energy had a certain configuration 13 point whatever billion years ago. And the potential was there for everything that we have today. Are you saying that that potential has been actualizing? Is that what you're saying? Is that what theistic evolution is necessarily saying?
Well, no, not really, because as I said, theistic evolution is mostly about the biology. What you're talking now is about cosmology, and the cosmology again has led, and the Big Bang Theory, I'll just remind people, was discovered by Father Georges Lemaitre, and it was criticized for lending credibility to the biblical worldview that the universe actually had a singular beginning. Right? So now we have come to a place where Big Bang is actually seen as anti-Christian by some circles, but there was a time when it was just the opposite. Big Bang theory is actually a very potent evidence, right, that the universe does have a beginning, at least our local one. So no, I'm not saying that there was a potency. I'm saying that there was a singular beginning, and this is the most important part of showing that the biblical framework and the worldview of a beginning is justified.
Okay. Do you believe in the first law of thermodynamics? Do you think it's universally valid, that there is a fixed amount of energy, a fixed amount of matter energy in the universe?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I accept the first law of thermodynamics.
And the second law, that it's constantly, the total amount of useful energy on average is always diminishing. Do you agree with the second law?
It's in a closed system, in a closed system.
Do you consider the physical universe a closed system or an open system?
I do not know.
Okay, well, physicists, I studied physics at university. Physicists consider the universe, the material universe, a closed system. This is why the first law of thermodynamics says that everything in the universe is all we've got, and matter can only be transformed. It can neither be created nor destroyed. This is for the entire universe. Okay, so do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't really see a lot of problem with that. I think that standard way people formalize the sacred phrases.
So this creates a problem for the theistic evolutionists, because you have to say that in the beginning, in that singularity, if you want to subscribe to the Big Bang model, and you don't have to, but it seems like you're leaning toward it. If you do subscribe to that, or whatever model you subscribe to, it doesn't really matter.
Again, just to clarify again, when I say that I accept theistic evolution, I mostly talk about biological evolution. That does not necessitate that I accept cosmological theories too, as long as I accept the diversity of species. That's what biological evolution is about. So while I do accept the Big Bang model, which many people are abandoning, many atheists are abandoning actually, because for whatever reason, but I personally do accept it. That is not necessary to accept theistic evolution. You could accept whatever you want about the cosmology, as far as you can still be a theistic evolutionist if you accept the diversification of the species, right? So that's the big separator, because I've seen a lot of this where people say, "Oh, you accept evolution, so that tell me this about cosmology, tell me this about chemistry." And I try to explain to them, none of these are integral to the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution by natural selection is about the diversity of species, about how they diversified. And this is what I accept. This is why I'm a theistic evolutionist, right? I could accept that and not believe in Big Bang, or believe in Big Bang.
Yeah, that's what I said. It doesn't really matter what model you adhere to. Don't get hung up on the biological stuff. I'm talking in very broad terms about the development of where we are today and everything we have today, the life we have today, and the different flora and fauna we have on Earth, and whatever. Basically, the configuration of matter energy that's distributed throughout all of space-time today came from the past. And the evolutionists, whether it's coincidental or whether it's part of their evolutionary theory, doesn't really matter to me. But they all emphasize the fact that things developed from non-life to life and so on and so forth. And to nitpick and say, well, that's not technically part of that field of evolution. Evolution is specifically about biology. I don't care. Let's ignore those distinctions, and let's just talk big picture. And if you can forgive me for using the word evolution in that broad way, otherwise I'll just switch to the word change, because change over time.
If you want, as long as it's clear that when I describe evolution, what I mean is biological evolution.
Sure. So we're going to talk about change in general, development of matter-energy configurations in space-time. So whatever your model is, doesn't matter, but you believe that everything back then, way back then, had the potential to develop by natural processes into everything that we have today. But there may be some divine intervention in there, right? Where does divine intervention come in, and how often are there miracles?
Yeah, no, I don't see it like that. I don't think that God has just left it and pops. And my framework is different. My framework is the very fact that natural laws exist and can logically be studied is inexplicable without something ultimately that would start resembling the divine. So what I think is that the very fact that these laws are there rather than not being is the reason you are led to something divine. I'm not saying that these laws existed, but once in a while God pops in and does some miracle. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the very fact that there are these patterns and there are these laws and there are these configurations is something that will ultimately, invariably, logically lead you to the divine. Right?
Yeah. There's something I want to go back to, something you said about the fetus developing into a fully grown human, the fully grown human. There is that potential within the human because of the nature of the human being. There is built into that nature a potential to develop, just like in the acorn, there's a potential for the oak tree. Okay. It may not reach that fruition, but there's the potential there, and it actualizes over time, and it takes in water and sunlight and all kinds of things from the environment, just like the fetus does. Okay. So there's a categorical difference between that development of your nature, which is built into your nature to have that potential for growth and for change. There's a categorical difference between that development and that potential and that actuality, and the difference, a completely different kind of animal. For example, a human coming from a bacteria, there's a completely different category of thinking that's taking place there, no?
Yeah. So can I ask a question? Do you think that the evidence matters when we're discussing theistic evolution?
Evidence always matters. Everything matters. Everything matters.
Do you believe, but is it your assertion that evidence does not point to biological evolution? Is that what you assert?
Yeah, we've never witnessed what they call macroevolution.
Can I ask you a question? You mentioned that you have a science background, or maybe...
Yeah, I studied physics.
So then this will be much, much more easier. Do you accept that an animal can produce offspring whose descendants can interbreed, but over time they start to differ so much that they can no longer interbreed?
Yeah, it's because the devolution. It's like the genetic entropy, right? We're not getting better. We're as time goes on, we're actually degrading.
So you accept that there can be a species, let's run down, that produces two lines whose descendants can no longer interbreed with each other?
Yes, of course.
So what stops you from saying that these have evolved into two different kinds?
Because you never get new functionality and new positive net gains in terms of functionality, in terms of something that doesn't. Well, something that doesn't have an eyeball doesn't give birth to something with an eyeball.
Right, but we who accept the theory of evolution do not believe that that happens either. That's a caricature. What we accept is that through diversity, species can no longer interbreed, and once they reach a point where they can't interbreed, they're starting to be considered a new subspecies or a species, and thus we get a diversification where from having one species, you get several different species, right?
Yeah. I don't have any problem with species. Is actually a very it's a very nitty gritty classification. You know, we need to go higher up on that classification scale to get to what I'm talking about. I mean, I don't like these sorts of classification categories. They're all very ambiguous and man-made and flexible too, because we can even the experts differ among themselves of how many species of finch there are, for example.
So your assertion is basically that animals, and I'll try to understand correctly if I understand, because I used to accept the creationist model. Is your assertion that various categories of animals were created independent of each other, and this is where we get kinds? Basically, we had a time where different categories of animals lived. lions and koalas were created separately from each other in fully developed forms, and this is how we define different kinds. Is that your assertion?
Yeah, I'm not going to dedicate myself to that category of kind because I don't even know how broad or how narrow the kind is in secular biological circles. And I'm not attached to any of these classification systems, but let's just say that God created a bunch of different kinds in the non-technical sense of that word, just different kinds of animals. Whether they're kinds in the technical sense is another question, right? I'm not married to that. But God created different kinds of animals. So I am not a cat, and I'm not an ape. I know you think that I'm an ape, but I do believe that I'm not an ape.
I don't think you're an ape. I simply go by what the word means in biology. It's not that I think you are an ape. I just use that term as biologists use it. I did not invent it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen enough of Aron Ra's videos, his phylogeny stuff, to know that he thinks I'm a eukaryote, and I think that I'm a human being, and I think that I have something in common with a rock, and I have something in common with a drop of water, and I have something in common with an ape, and I have something in common with a banana, and I'm not ashamed to have something in common with a pile of excrement, right? I have something in common with a pile of excrement, right? Doesn't mean I'm a pile of excrement. Doesn't mean I evolved from a pile of excrement. So we need to be careful when we're pattern matching. And if you look at the phylogeny project, it's really embarrassing when you see the way that one branch way over here is reconnected way over here because of some genetic discovery, and they're like, oops, okay, fits over here. And it's very flexible, it's very adaptable, it's very changeable, because their starting presumption is that, look, we can classify things together like with like, and the more they have in common in terms of physiology or in terms of genetics, we can classify this. That's the underlying assumption of this secular evolution, and I think theistic evolution falls into that too.
Yeah, no, the problem again is, as I said, is with evaluating the evidence, because ultimately, look what you concede, and this is the most important one. You obviously concede that through natural selection, species, or whatever category you want to use, can adapt to their environments in different ways. You accept, for example, that species can develop more positive traits, right? Like having fur to withstand cold, and the species that developed in the south might have shorter fur so as not to get too hot. You accept that, obviously. And
I accept, long hair, short hair, dogs, long legs,
so
short legged dogs, and that sort of thing.
From that point of view, my point is, what stops you from saying evolution has taken place once that happens and those species can't breed with each other anymore, right? They can't interbreed. They cannot have children. They have adapted to different environments. What stops you from saying evolution has taken place?
Because I don't see any new functionality being introduced into the gene pool. I see a degradation of the gene pool always. We never see a higher form of life coming from a lower form of life. We've never seen it. No one's ever seen that in the laboratory or in nature.
But we don't define evolution that way. The way we define evolution is the change of allele functions. What we define as evolution is this macro evolution basically would be simply speciation, which is the inability to interbreed anymore. And the species have become so diverse that they can't interbreed. They're separate. They have to interbreed with others. And as far as the development goes, their appearance starts to change, right? Because they have fur, for example, and different functions. So
yeah, but they always had the potential for fur. That's the thing. Anything that develops any attribute or any characteristic, whether physical or whatever, it always had the potential for that. And that's what separates the young earth creationist from any sort of evolutionist, whether you're a theistic evolutionist or any other kind of evolutionist, is that we don't believe that an amoeba or a bacterium has the potential to become a human given enough time and given enough random mutations.
So you could you don't need to go that far. I mean, if you accept the basics of evolution, then you could simply say, I accept evolution, but I don't accept, for example, a specific form. I don't see why you would separate between accepting that there could basically be a single species and then diversify into multiple species that can interbreed. You say, oh, it could never become this good. How do you even define complexity? Because if you look at some animals, they're much more complex and they had, a common ancestor. And you probably accept that wolves and certain small dogs had the common ancestor. And if you look at intelligent wolves who are in packs, who have a huge hierarchy, and then look at a small dog that is that can't even bark properly, and that they come from the same
loss of function again. Loss of function. It's always a loss of functionality over time. This is the thing. We're not getting improvements when we get these purebred dogs that are always sick. They're always degraded in every way, shape, and form. And your example with going from one kind of dog to another kind of dog, it just reinforces the idea that we've never seen a dog turn into a non-dog or a dog come from a non-dog. It's always
you accept that dogs and wolves had the common ancestor, right?
Yeah, they both look like dogs to me. I'm no expert. There may be.
So it's about looks. So it's what looks to you like they're like. Is that it?
No, it's a theological question, right? I accept young Earth creationism because that's what my church. Excuse me. I don't accept theistic evolution. I accept young Earth creationism because that's what my church has always taught. And so when I look at the different life forms and the diversity of life, I don't try to imagine, as you do and as Aron Ra does, that we all have a common ancestor, which was a single-celled creature or some sort of bacterium or something like that. I don't do that.
You said that a dog cannot come from a non-dog, but then you accepted that wolves and dogs had a common ancestor. So was it a wolf or a dog that was a common ancestor of both of them?
Well, I mean, I'm using the word dog very loosely as that common ancestor, right? But I mean, if it turns out it has some long, fancy Latin name, it's going to look like a dog. I guarantee you that. It's not going to look like anything else.
Is it about looks? Is it about looks?
No, it's about Catholic dogma, and we have been taught. The tradition teaches us from day dot that that special creation is the case, and that theistic evolution is not the case. And we have dogmas which forbid, I think, implicitly, if not explicitly, that forbid us from entertaining theistic evolution. So it has nothing to do with my appreciation of a four-limbed creature and how much it looks alike with a dog and a wolf and those sorts of things. No, it has nothing to do with my amateur approach to biology. It has nothing to do with that. I mean, like I said, it could be a long Latin name of the common ancestor of the wolf and the dog. I don't care, but I'm just going to call it a dog until I learn the fancy Latin name for the common ancestor. But I guarantee you, it will look like a dog. It won't look like an amoeba or something like that.
Are you a Sedevacantist?
No.
So then, do you believe that the Catholic Church can be led by a heretic who does not profess the true faith?
Sure.
You believe that the Church can be led by that person?
Yeah, I believe that the Church. I believe the Pope can be a heretic. The Church is not dogmatically defined whether or not the Pope can be a material heretic. I believe he can be.
So when Pope Pius XII, and I will find the quote now to just share it probably in the chat, or Leo XIII, defined that a Catholic is someone who is baptized and accepts the true faith. Do you follow that?
Yeah.
So do you think a Catholic can be someone who is baptized but does not accept the true faith?
Well, I mean, I've never met a Catholic who accepts the true faith completely. So I hope that what do they call it? What's that sort of ignorance that we have that allows us to not fall into sin? Invincible ignorance. I hope that invincible ignorance is behind the little old lady that I met at church who believes in reincarnation, and the other one that believes in this New Age teaching and the other New Age teaching, and the priest I met that doesn't believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. I'm hoping and praying that they have invincible ignorance because they've strayed from the Catholic faith. But technically, I mean, they're material. They've strayed from the teachings of Jesus Christ. They've strayed from the faith. I think it's going a little bit far to say that they're a heretic, because to be a heretic, you need to be corrected by the church and to obstinately refuse to come in line. And that very rarely happens to any individual down at street level.
So then you believe that Pope Francis, probably Pope Benedict XVI, Pope John Paul II, were pretty much heretics denying what was taught, as you said, probably dogmatically about young Earth creationism?
No, I mean, there's been no explicit dogma saying that special creation of the body and young Earth creationism, the age of the Earth, and these sorts of things. There is no explicit dogma. I'm inferring, I'm using inference based on existing explicit dogmas that talk about related issues, right? So this is a theological speculation that I'm engaged in, and I'm free to do that because there is no dogmatic pronouncement on young Earth creationism. I know that I don't have the weight of dogma behind me to say, look, here's the dogma, young Earth creationism is the case, but I'm speculating based on overwhelming consensus of the fathers and on the connected dogmas, which are infallible, and the connected teachings of the living magisterium, which are infallible. For example, the ecumenical councils. If you look at the Council of Trent, for example, it strongly supports young Earth creationism. And it's not explicitly defined by the church. So you are free. I'm not calling you a heretic. I'm not saying that you strayed from the true faith. I'm not saying that Pope Francis has strayed from the true faith on that point, but he may have strayed from defined dogma on other points. I don't know, but I'm not policing him or anyone else, right? It's up to the individual's conscience to learn the faith and to know the faith and to adhere to the faith. I give the benefit of the doubt to Pope Francis and to you and to everyone else. I think Pope Francis is a good Catholic man with a good saintly man. I wouldn't be surprised if he's canonized as a saint in the future. I don't agree with him on evolution, obviously, but that's something that the church allows us for now to investigate. Is he investigating it, or is he just shrugging his shoulders like most people and saying, go along to get along? That I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely think Pope Francis has been very supportive of science and has encouraged other Roman Catholics to not, be more fundamentalist about this subject. Obviously, I do not think that young Earth creationist Catholics themselves are theologically wrong. I just think that scientifically it's important to accept the natural revelation too. And I think that the natural revelation does point to the idea that species can diversify and species are interconnected and interrelated. And if you are not willing to say that the Catholic Church has dogmatically taught young Earth creationism, and you're willing to say that you can safely be a Roman Catholic and accept overwhelming scientific evidence, my question is why not? At least from my perspective. Maybe you don't agree that that's the case, but I don't see the whole point. Otherwise, you'd have to pronounce the fact that the church was by heretics for the last 3 papacies at least. And that's, of course, I cannot comment on Pope John Paul I or Pope Paul VI. I do not have knowledge whether they accepted, but I know that Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis with a more pronounced emphasis have made it clear that they do not accept young Earth creationism. No, Pope Benedict XVI showed some sympathy towards intelligent design, but it would still be hard for me to accept that perspective that the church has taught this. The church's tradition has taught this, as you have said, because you said that was the reason why. You didn't say there was just evidence, which I tried pointing you towards. You said that no, the reason I believe this is because this is how it has been taught. So if that's how it's been taught, then I don't know how you can argue that Pope Francis is not someone who is mistaken theologically, not just historically or evident theologically, because what you're saying is that the church has taught this dogmatically when it hasn't.
No. I never said it would taught it dogmatically. I say there are connected dogmas which would necessarily imply, I think, but I'm speculating here, that I think necessarily imply that theistic evolution is off the table. That's my speculation. I could be wrong, but I'm firmly convinced that the dogma that God created a good world and the dogma that this soul is the form of the body, those exclude the possibility of theistic evolution. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong. I'm not saying that it's a dogmatic teaching and you're a heretic if you don't believe in young Earth creationism. I'm not saying that. And I want to emphasize, since you brought up Pope Francis and the recent popes, I do want to emphasize to you, you asked me if I'm a Sedevacantist. Far from it. My number one principle is love and respect and docile and submissive obedience to the living magisterium. And that includes Pope Francis, and it is centered on Pope Francis, and that's where most of my emphasis lies in terms of my Catholicism. It's on the authority of the successor of St. Peter. He holds the keys. We need to love him. We need to respect him. And not only that, we need to follow his lead in terms of emphasis. He is not emphasizing young earth creationism and how that's the next new point that we're going to that all Catholics need to get in line with. What he's emphasizing are what the right wing sees as progressive notions, and the right wing sees him as some sort of socialist and some sort of they see him as a heretic. I don't see him that way. I see him as emphasizing Christian, Catholic social teachings, a real emphasis on the dignity of the person, and I think it's very important to get behind Pope Francis on everything that he's emphasizing, because we have a Pope for a reason. I believe that God Almighty gives us the Pope, maybe the Pope we deserve or the Pope that we need. It's neither here nor there. That's the Pope that we have. And if it turns out, as some of my rad trad friends think, that he is the Antichrist and he's a homosexual and he's a socialist and he's a vegan or whatever other slurs they want to throw at Pope Francis, if it turns out that he's not a legitimate and valid Pope, that if he's not the Vicar of Christ, then the Church will tell us that, and then I will stop submitting in docile and loving obedience to that man. But until then, I have to give him the highest place in my worldview. He is at the summit. He's above God Almighty because he holds the keys, and he's like Noah. I have to get into the ark if I will be saved, otherwise I'm doomed. And
so I didn't understand what you said. I do not. Do you accept that the Pope is above God Almighty? Is that what you said?
For me, because I need to get into the ark to be saved. So if I listen to the Vicar of Christ, then I will put God first. I will have the Ten Commandments, a proper interpretation of the Ten Commandments, a proper interpretation of Holy Scripture, of Holy Tradition. I will have a proper place for Mary and the saints. I will have a proper ecclesiology. I will have a proper theology. I will have a proper social teaching. So this, for me, it's more important to have Pope Francis than it is to have God Almighty, because there are many Sedevacantists, for example, that have many of the wholesome things that I have as a faithful Catholic, but they don't have Pope Francis, and so they are outside of the Church, and they are in deep trouble. They need to get into the ark. That's number one. They cannot go to heaven if they don't get into the ark.
Excuse me, maybe I didn't understand the term. I will repeat. You believe that the Pope is above God Almighty? Is that what you said?
Yeah, because there are plenty of people burning in hell who believed in God, who worshipped God, right? But they refused to bow to Noah, to St. Peter.
I totally disagree with both the wording and the idea that implies. I think that is totally outside of anything the Roman Catholic Church has taught.
It's a dogma. It's an explicit dogma that there's absolutely no possibility of salvation outside of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. You have to get in eventually. I'm not saying that no Jews get in, no Muslims get in, no Hindus or Buddhists get in. Lots of them get in, but they submit to the Pope and to Mary and everyone else.
Outside of the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. That doesn't imply, of course, formal membership. But the idea that the Pope is above God Almighty is heresy and absolutely unacceptable in Roman Catholic.
Well, because I submit to the Pope, I'm not a heretic because I submit to the Pope, precisely because I submit to the Pope, right? There are many people who
submit to God, and that's why you submit to his church, not the other way around.
No, but you don't seem to understand. The Pope is not God, but he is God's vicar on earth, and if I do not submit to him, then it matters little if I say my rosary 10 times a day and I have a great devotion to Mary and the saints, because the Sedevacantists do that and those at Medjugorje do that, right? So it doesn't matter if I have God and if I have Mary and if I have the saints, if I don't have the Pope, right? You have to submit to the living magisterium. That's my point. That's why I place the Pope above God Almighty in that sense, in the same sense that if I lived during the time of Noah, I would put Noah above God Almighty in terms of I need to submit to Noah in order to have life, because that's what God has ordained. God ordained that those who refused out of their pride to get on the ark perished, and so it is of the utmost importance. Many people outside of the ark that perished in the flood believed in God and worshipped God, but they were too proud to humble themselves to a mere man that God had appointed, that man being Noah, and we all know the character flaws of Noah, right?
No, as I said, I completely disagree with that idea. The papacy and the Bishop of Rome, the history behind it does not support that view of it at all. Being part of the church is not.
That's exactly why I submit to the Pope, because he tells me how he tells me how to sort my priorities, right? Because I submit to Pope Francis, I know that the only commandment is love of God and love of neighbor for God's sake. So I have everything in its proper proportion, in its proper hierarchy, precisely because I submit to the man who was appointed by God to be the vicar of Christ. The Sedevacantists don't have that, right? So they are in grave danger. I don't know if you realize this, but the Sedevacantists are in grave danger until such time as they humble themselves and they submit to the one true church and to that man who holds the keys. Do you not see that?
I agree that Sedevacantism is not true, and for the reasons, but historical views, and if I may speak, I'll highlight that historically the church has placed even the councils above popes. If you look at Pope Honorius I and the mistake with monothelitism that was condemned at the Sixth Council, the whole idea that Pope is above what has been historically taught, or that the Pope is above what God has left, is, of course, contrary to it. The Pope Francis cannot introduce new doctrine. He cannot even make it a dogma, something that has not already been within mainstream Catholicism. The Bishop of Rome holds, and historically has held, much less authority than you're willing to.
Well, you're completely missing the point. First of all, I want to correct you historically. Those who were pushing that a council was superior to a pope, they were explicitly condemned by subsequent councils and by the popes that ratified those councils. The Pope is supreme, and he doesn't need the church in order to speak with the full authority. He has the full jurisdiction and the full authority. So that's a historical fact of the Catholic faith. You need to look into that, because the council is not superior to the Pope. This is well established in the history of the church and the history of the councils. You need to look into that.
Do you personally believe that the Pope can overturn the rulings of the Council of Nicaea?
I have never said that the Pope is omnipotent or that the Pope replaces God. I said that it's more important to me. It's higher on my list of priorities to submit to Pope Francis right now than it is to submit to God, because those who submit to God there are many who are outside of the Catholic Church. Like you said, they may find their way into the church and make it to heaven. God only knows, right? But my point is not that he is God Almighty, that he is in every way superior to God. My point is that it is of the utmost importance to me that I'm in union with the living magisterium and that I'm in docile submission to the living magisterium, because with that comes everything else. The church is a perfect society. All of the means of salvation are in the Catholic Church. Now, there are means, like you said, there are means of salvation outside of her visible boundaries, and that will help bring people in to the church. This is the teaching of Vatican II. If you read Vatican II, the documents of Vatican II, you'll understand my perspective. It's all about bringing people into the ark. If you're not in the ark, you're doomed, so you have to get into the ark. So God allows the means of salvation to be propagated outside of the ark. Just like with Noah in his day, he went around advertising, and there were little Noahidic cults that cropped up, and there were many saving truths outside of Noah's family and of Noah's domain geographically, but only 8 people made it onto the ark, and that's a historical reality from my perspective.
Yeah, so it may be that our frameworks differ, but as I've said personally, for me, I accept any authority that the Bishop of Rome has or had. I accept specifically because first I accept God, and then accept Jesus, and I accept the church he established. I do not first submit to Pope and then find God. I first find God and then I find his church. So the submission to God entails submitting to what he has established. It's not the other way around, and to me it's heretical to even suggest that.
Yeah, because you're mischaracterizing my model. My model is that think in terms of Noah with his ark. Okay, the most important human being at that time, the most important person, even above God Almighty, was Noah, because that's how God ordained that salvation history would unfold. So God is humble. He's not like us. He's not proud. So he knows that he's top dog. But when he obliges us to submit to a mere human being, whether it's Noah, whether it's St. Peter, whether it's Pope Francis, or whether it's his Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary, he knows that the demons are incapable of humbling themselves. But God is not incapable of humbling himself. And we as Catholics cannot be proud. We need to humble ourselves as well. And that's why, but it's a narrow path. That's why only 8 made it onto the ark in Noah's day. And that's why many today are complaining about Pope Francis, and many Sedevacantists don't even believe there has been a Pope for many, many years, right? So we need to be humble as God is humble. And I'm not saying what you think I'm saying. I'm not saying anything heretical, God forbid, right? I'm submitting to Pope Francis precisely because he is the representative of Jesus Christ, and he is the visible head of the church and of that living magisterium.
Can I ask a question? If tomorrow it was discovered, I know this won't happen and I don't believe this, but let's just say it was discovered, Jesus never existed, but the Pope says that he did and others are mistaken, what would you submit to? Would you submit to evidence that Jesus did not exist, or would you submit to the Pope and what he says?
Well, there's a hierarchy in the sciences. I put God Almighty at the top of the hierarchy. He is science itself with a capital S. Beneath that, we have divine revelation. And beneath that, we have theology and various sciences of theology and philosophy beneath that, and then the natural sciences and so on and so forth, right? So there's a hierarchy in the sciences. The physical natural sciences will never, no matter how they seem to contradict Catholic dogma, they will never sway me. They may make me nervous. I may start sweating and losing sleep at night because of the overwhelming amount of natural evidence that seems to contradict the dogmas of the church. But I will always, as a principle, put God first, divine revelation, and then, that includes tradition and scripture, and then theology, philosophy, and then natural science. So natural science is really low on the totem pole. That's why I'm very comfortable being a young earth creationist, even though everyone is so convinced by the so-called evidence. The evidence is real, but how do you interpret that evidence? That's the key question. And it's the same thing if they found the bones of Jesus. I just wouldn't believe that they were the bones of Jesus. I just wouldn't believe it because natural science doesn't hold as much sway with me, doesn't have as much authority with me as philosophy or theology or divine revelation, and certainly not of God Almighty.
My point is that I do not understand how it is possible to distinguish human submission we owe to the Pope from the submission we owe to Christ. I mean, I personally, acknowledge the Pope as an authority only and solely for the fact that God and Jesus recognized the papacy and his church established. It's not the other way around for me. I do not see how it's not heretical. And perhaps, again, you might be under saying something else, of course, and misrepresenting. But for me, that language is completely unacceptable. The office of the Bishop of Rome is not supposed to be one of an oracle or something. It's a pastor. It's a role of the servant of the servants who has been entrusted with leading the church, and it is not more important than God Almighty. I completely disagree with this.
Well, if you had a Sedevacantist friend and he said, "Is it important that I submit to the living magisterium of the Holy Roman Catholic Church that's currently in Rome, in the Vatican?" Would you say it's not important because you have God, you have Mary, you have the saints, you have all your liturgy, and you have your version of the Eucharist and all that? Would you say it's not important, or would you say that it is the most important thing? It is the most important thing, even though you have God, even though you have Jesus Christ, even though you have the Trinity, even though you have the Incarnation.
I disagree with that. I disagree that you have Jesus Christ if you do not submit to Jesus.
So you don't think that the Sedevacantists believe in God, a triune God, that they don't believe that the second person incarnated. They don't believe that the second person built the church on St. Peter. They don't believe in the salvation history and the saints and all that. You think that the Sedevacantists don't have all of that?
They don't have all of that because Sedevacantists believe that the church ended when Jesus said that the church would never end and would never be prevailed against. So they do not have all that.
Okay, do they believe in God the Father?
Yes, they do believe in God the Father.
So if they came to you and said, "Is it important to me that I submit to Pope Francis?" would you say, no, you have God the Father and God the Father is above Pope Francis, therefore it's not important?
I would tell them, trust God the Father completely if you have him on his side. That's what I would tell them.
I would say that if you aren't submitting to Christ's church, then you are in grave danger. That's what I would say. That's the difference between us.
Yes, but the reason I want them to submit to Christ's church is because first I want them to accept Christ. I not first want them to accept the church and then find out who Christ was. We first start with God and we submit to the church because it's God who established it. If the church was not established by God, it's worthless completely. This is the most important thing to understand.
Of course, this is what the church teaches, right? That's why. But it's only those who submit. It's only those who submit to the living magisterium that belong to the church and that have a proper appreciation of all of the teachings of every period of the living magisterium throughout history. The Sedevacantists, I can assure you, I've spoken with many of them, and they believe in the Catholic Church. They just think that there's some miraculous solution that's going to come down from heaven, and God's going to resolve the problem, and the church is indefectible. It's just going through a rough patch right now. I've spoken to so many Sedevacantists. None of them believe that the church, that they do not belong to the Catholic Church, right? It's just they're mistaken. They've been led astray by, by God knows what, maybe the demons, maybe by their pride. But I can guarantee that they all believe that they profess to believe in the Trinity, they profess to believe in the Church, but they refuse to submit to the Vicar of Christ. That's why I emphasize submission to the living magisterium. I'm not saying anything heretical. How could I when I submit to the living magisterium? If you ask me about any point of doctrine, I'll say, what does the church teach? If you ask a Sedevacantist about any point of doctrine, they will say, well, what does the church teach before 1959, right? So I say that they are very close to the kingdom of God, but that in 1959 or whatever date they draw in the sand, whatever line they draw in the sand, they're removing themselves from the church. They are excluding themselves from the Holy Roman Catholic Church, outside of which there is absolutely no possibility of salvation. They're fooled and they're in great danger. That's why I would recommend to any Sedevacantist who came to me to submit to the Pope while there's still time.
Yeah, I definitely think that there was a better language to express that idea because, yes, I think that Sedevacantists are definitely mistaken. Their position basically invalidates the Catholic doctrine if someone were to consistently hold, and they absolutely have to accept that the Bishop of Rome is not an anti-pope, but a legitimately elected pope from God. That is absolutely important for a set of accounts. So if that's all you were trying to say, then I definitely agree with it.
Yeah, my language is shocking, but it's there's nothing heretical about my position because my position is the Catholic position, and my only answer to any question about theology or about doctrine is, what does the church teach? And if you and I differ about things that are non-essential, because the young earth creationism has not been explicitly defined dogmatically, if we disagree, then Vatican II says that there should be a healthy diversity of views, right? And that's what the various popes have said. Vatican II famously said that in essentials unity, in non-essentials a healthy diversity, and in all things charity. That sums up my approach to religion when discussing young earth creationism with those who have a different point of view. I don't see you as a heretic, and I hope you don't see me as a heretic just because I happen to side with what you think is a quaint and outmoded sort of anti-science view of the data, the evidence, the mountains of evidence that Aron Ra and Matt Dillahunty think assure them victory in the ideological battle against religion, right? How do you feel being on the side of Aron Ra and Matt Dillahunty and all these other colorful anti-theists?
How do you feel about being on the side of Aron Ra when arguing with flat earthers? I don't see it as something. I disagree with Mr. Ra, Mr. Dillahunty on very important issues. What we agree on is science. And as I said, the church has not dogmatically touched on that subject. You believe that it has, and I agree that the earliest ones themselves did believe it because of various reasons, but they did not dogmatically define young earth creationism or creationism. So I think it's I have more than open leeway to accept theistic evolution and be in line with historical Roman Catholicism.
Do you think the atheist, the secular evolutionist, just in terms of biology now, Do you think that they applaud you for being a theistic evolution, or do they think that you've completely missed the point of biological evolution and they're happy to have you stray from the traditional teaching of young earth creationism because that's a victory for them? But they're also behind your back mocking and ridiculing your naive understanding of the biology that's involved, because that's what I've experienced in the secular community when it comes to evolution and
No,
theistic
not really.
evolution.
I haven't experienced things like that. I don't even see much of applause as if they've kind of gotten me on their side or anything like that. They for a lot of these atheists, the issue of evolution doesn't come up unless someone is strictly an earth creationist. Usually, when we discuss, it's mostly about the cosmological argument about what would even prove God's existence. But this idea that evolution is something that has to be forced does not occur. It's not that we're on the same side and they're high-fiving each other that they finally won me over or something. No, it doesn't really come up. In fact, usually they assume that one accepts some form of theistic evolution, and if they find out, oh, okay, you're still a younger creationist, then they start to talk about younger creationism. So I, as I said, am pretty what would I don't personally categorize myself, but it is what would be considered a conservative position. I still hold to a lot of very positions that are associated with more conservative forms of Roman Catholicism.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I want to just talk a little bit about two quick topics. One is the flood. Do you think that there were more than 8 people alive after Noah's flood, or do you think that the Bible is historically accurate that only 8 people survived on the entire planet of Earth after the flood?
Yeah, no, I don't believe that it was only 8 people that survived, but I just want to make something clear. The flood story, I believe, and Aron Ra, of course, agrees with me, is, in his own way at least, is actually based on an actual event that actually happened of a very catastrophic large flood in that really inundated the known civilized world, right? So this would definitely be something that would be described as the whole world or something. So yes, I do believe that there was a figure. Now, again, the issue with Mr. Ra came up, whether his name would have been Noah or not. I think that's a secondary issue. We call him Noah. And there was a real person he feared. He actually believed in the one true God. And he was a Catholic, even though he did not hold the Roman Catholic faith. He felt, no, he held to the correct faith at the time. And this is why for us, Noah is basically a saint. We invoke him in our prayers too, right? And this person literally existed, and he literally trusted in God and survived. No, I do not accept the fact that it was a global flood. I accept a localized, huge flood that would have been described in that language. I think this is totally in line with what the church finds acceptable to hold. And if you know people that have really influenced me on Catholic answers, particularly Tim Staples, Trent Horn, Jimmy Akin, very intelligent people, they would probably agree more with me on this subject.
I want to talk about the scientific evidence at the wedding at Cana, the first public miracle that Jesus did at the prompting of Mary and the beginning of his public life. There were 6 jugs representing the 6 days, I think. And everyone thought that wine was natural wine made from natural grapes that had a natural history, that had quote unquote evolved, and these grapes had developed and they were matured and fermented and all this sort of thing. But in fact, it was a miracle. So the evidence seemed to contradict that. The other evidence I want to look at is when the scientists take the Eucharist and they put it under a microscope, it seems to be bread and wine. So can you just talk about how scientific evidence isn't always an indication that our faith is a bunch of childish nonsense, right?
Yeah, so obviously I don't believe that it is childish nonsense. The issue is that the Catholic Church has never taught that put under a microscope the bread would look different. If the Catholic Church had taught that and the microscope had found something different, then that would be a different issue. We have to clarify here. The Roman Catholic Church about the Eucharist has never taught that. So if someone puts it under a microscope and then says, I have shown one dogma of Catholicism to be false, he is strawmanning the position that has never been taught by the Roman Church. That's the big difference that I think. So yes, I do not believe that science can, quote, disprove the Catholic faith. I believe that it can modify certain things and help us appreciate certain things in the same way that certain things have helped us reform. And you see modern Roman Catholicism is in many ways different from 5th century Catholicism. We have cardinals. And yes, again, there were certain things that developed that helped make this more change the standings, the non-essentials, as you would say, and distinguish it from the and we distinguish this from the essentials. That's the most important part. Right? We have the so many things. You know about the Tridentine Mass, right? And there were different liturgical forms before the Tridentine Mass. It just so happened that the Protestant Reformation happened to kick in this organized form of liturgy. Is that bad? Not necessarily. This is the same way I see it. I don't see science as disproving something. It simply modifies and gives us a new way to look at it. And yes, it is possible for someone to come up and tell us 3rd century Christians would not recognize the Tridentine Mass. Does it mean anything? No, it does not. Yes, some things develop. We have different views on it, but the essentials remain the same. The essential of a 3rd century Christian celebrating the Eucharist in a catacomb, and the essentials of Pope Pius XII conducting papal mass using the Tridentine liturgical rites are the same. So that's the same thing I would raise here, the same issue. I don't think that science can disprove or is trying to disprove it. Our knowledge of science has simply changed the non-essentials, while on the essentials we remain the same, and we accept the dogmatic teachings of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, I believe the Mass was standardized in the 16th century, if I'm not mistaken. So that's quite late. It's a late development. But the essentials of the sacrament of the Eucharist are very few. It's the form and the matter, right? It's the words of consecration and wheat bread and grape wine. So it's the essentials are really, really small in number, and so we have a lot of room to express ourselves in liturgy and to worship God in a colorful way, hopefully always in a respectful and a dignified way, with devotion and with reverence and awe, and beauty of course has to be part of it. And I don't want to end up with a stripped down Protestant sort of worship service with the bare bones of what's necessary with form and matter for the Eucharist. But what would you say if it were dogmatically defined within your lifetime that evolution is false and that the Earth is less than, say, 10, 12,000 years old? Would that be challenging for you if you believe that it was a legitimate council, an ecumenical council, which is thereby infallible? Would it challenge you? Would you consider leaving the Catholic Church, or would you just roll with it and say, well, I guess I've been looking at the mountains of data and interpreting it wrongly? What would you say?
Yeah, so you mentioned, I think before the live stream even started, previous live stream, but kind of feel that what you mentioned kind of made me realize that there's a bit of a separation from you and me. You accept Catholicism more of a zero-sum game. Basically, you have much less of a leeway. I do not see it that way as far as the essentials are concerned. I am open to changing my mind on a lot of things, and that would still not impact my Roman Catholic beliefs. I, first of all, do not believe that such a thing can happen because the Church cannot err. I don't believe that the Church can err on such a matter. But if it were to happen, I would explore what is a historical precedent for such a thing, right? And something I wouldn't just get up one day and walk away from the Church because of something like that. Right? There are again other people that disagree on some things. You mentioned, for example, someone who believes the Eucharist is symbolic, and that's probably much more heretical than a lot of Catholics who believe that the contraception is acceptable. And am I willing to say that someone who uses contraception stops being Catholic? By no means. What I'm saying is that we have to correct people if they make a mistake without trying to tell them you're not Catholic anymore. And you mentioned invincible ignorance. But also the second part is we have to keep our minds open too. And if such a thing were to happen, which I do not believe can, I would consider, talking with a canon lawyer, for example, to understand what this would mean in terms of history. What is a historical precedent for such a thing happening? Because remember, this sort of zero-sum approach is taken by you, but it's also taken by Protestants, because I talk with a lot of them. I shouldn't have said Protestants, I'm sorry. I should have said critics of Catholicism. And I talk with them, and they tell me all the same things. You see, popes were wrong once. Some of them, what we would today consider dogmatic. Should you leave the faith? And I try to explain to them, you bringing me up a problem with Catholicism is a problem with Catholicism. It doesn't somehow validate your position, right? And that's the same approach I would take. If it happened, which I do not believe will or can, of course, that's not the approach that the popes have taken in recent years. There is no evidence that any other dogmatic decision, any major dogmatic decision is even coming, let alone such an antagonizing one, and something that would go so far from Pope Pius XII's very important encyclical, Divino Afflante Spiritu, right? So yeah, I think that not only won't it happen, but if it did, that would be much like a question: what would you say if tomorrow the church defined, that squares don't exist or something? It's more of an intellectual exercise rather than anything.
Well, I mean, if tomorrow the church contradicted herself relative to established dogmas, I would leave Christianity. But I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'm going to let you go here, but
that's a heretical view. The church does not have that authority. For example, the papal infallibility, if you're familiar with it, the Pope does not have absolute authority to define everything they want. The Pope can only dogmatically define something that is within the lines of Catholicism. So the Pope cannot get up tomorrow and say, I dogmatically ex cathedra defined that Jesus was not divine. That would not fly. We would not accept that. It's not that, now it's contradicted it, we have to leave Christianity. That's not true. And also, I also want to remark that I would not leave Christianity or even the Catholic faith, even if certain things about Catholicism were not true, because the major parts are, if Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead and his followers who believe it are saved, then even if I am mistaken about even major things, but this part remains true, I will still be a Christian.
Yeah, if I'm mistaken about dogma, that's no big deal. But if the living magisterium, which is infallible, is contradicting itself, that's a big deal. But with the question of the Immaculate Conception, that was hotly contested. You do know that, right, by saints and by geniuses in the Middle Ages. And Blessed John Duns Scotus pushed for the Immaculate Conception. It was ultimately dogmatized formally and explicitly, and we cannot debate that anymore. That's a closed chapter. So it's the same thing with many dogmas. There was an open discussion and a freedom of opinion that was possible and that was encouraged even. But once it's a closed issue, it's a closed issue. So I hope you realize that this is the way that the church moves forward always.
Well, yes, I accept that now, but I think that there are more what you would call liberal Catholics who, for example, would argue, and I would be willing to. Would argue, for example, that the whole idea that the church is infallible in such a way is something that was a later development. While I don't hold to that, you still have to be open-minded that there are such ideas, right? I mean, you understand what I mean, right?
No, I don't understand. You're saying that you think that it's a late development that the church is infallible? No, that's what you're saying?
No. That's not what I'm saying. I do not believe that. But what I'm saying is that there still would be Catholics who would argue that. Right? Some Catholics would argue that these closed chapters or something are not something that was taught in the early church. And I don't but you have to be still mindful that such people argue, and the arguments should not be just ignored. They should still engage. So
yeah, I'm not expecting the weeds to disappear among the wheat. Jesus Christ promised me that the weeds would be among the wheat and there would be wolves among sheep's clothing. And if you say you're without sin, you're a liar. So, I mean, I'm a sinner. I'm wrong about all kinds of stuff, right? I hope I'm not wrong about anything that's essential to my Catholic faith, because then I'm in deep trouble unless I am unless I have that invincible ignorance, which I guess I do, because I'm not aware of straying from the church's magisterium, right, and straying from tradition. Whereas some people say, well, I like to have sex outside of marriage, therefore that part of the church teaching I just don't agree with, and I just have sex or masturbate. Like a lot of men in the church don't like that rule that you can't masturbate, right? So I mean, I wouldn't say they're heretics and they're going to burn in hell. I'm just saying that they're consciously aware that the teaching is there and they just choose to ignore it.
Yeah, as I said, on most issues I align, but this is the same debate I've had with others. This is the bad Catholic versus non-Catholic debate. So if you were to interact with, you're familiar with the Most Holy Family monasteries.
Yeah.
If you were to interact with them, they would say that someone who commits the sin of onanism is no longer a Catholic if they do it consciously. I disagree with this view. For me, Roman Catholic is someone who is baptized or accepts the true faith. And after that, if they still are engaging in the Catholic faith but do not follow it sufficiently, I would be more comfortable saying they're bad Catholic, they're non-Catholic. I'm not willing to dismiss somebody else's Catholicism. Like, I'm not willing to tell them you're not a Roman Catholic unless they, for example, profess that they don't believe in Christ or whatever.
Yeah, I agree with you. I am very reluctant to condemn anyone, and I always give the benefit of the doubt. Why? Because that's what my church tells me that I have to do. I have to do that as a Catholic, because to do otherwise is hypocritical and is anti-Christian, right? We have to give the benefit of the doubt, and we have to allow for the mercy of God to work with people where they are. And think about the reduction to absurdity proof for your moderate position and my moderate position. It's the same moderate Catholic position. The reduction to absurdity proof that we're right to be moderate is, what would it mean if every Catholic adhered perfectly to Catholicism? It would mean that every Catholic is a holy saint that's walking around on this planet, healing and converting people just by their very presence, because of the holiness of their lives and of their prayerfulness and the way they avail themselves worthily, in a worthy manner, of prayer and the sacraments of the church. It would be a completely different world. You and I are not naive. We know we live in a fallen world. We know that you and I are weak sinners. The Pope is a weak sinner. And most of people in salvation history are weak sinners. Even the Jews, the chosen people, a lot of them were weak sinners, right? That's why we elevate the saints and the patriarchs and those who, by God's grace, were allowed to rise above their frailty, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that statement.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to address, or did you just want to say goodbye and give the closing thought to end the show?
No, I definitely would like to comment. Now, I'll take the role of asking several questions, right? So here's my question. What do you think about the more more revised approach to non-Catholics? So, for example, my position, and this is something I'll highlight, I'm not being intentionally critical, is that while the church more strictly condemned schismatics, right? I think that Pope Benedict XVI made this clear that the people who have come to believe in Christ non-conventionally, let's say non-conventionally from our point of view, people who are Protestants, that's the way they were raised, and they honestly seek God, are not in the same category as non-believers. They still have some grace.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. That was Pope Benedict XVI who emphasized that over and over again. I agree 100%. We can't paint them with the same brush that we paint someone like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, or whatever, even though I hesitate even to condemn them, because I don't know what they were dealing with a church that may have gone off the rails in the Middle Ages. There may have been a lot of abuses that justified some sort of rebellion, and that rebellion just generated all sorts of error and confusion in these fathers of Protestantism, to use a sort of a borrowed term from Catholicism. They're not really fathers, but you know what I mean. I mean, I do have mixed emotions about the Protestant heroes, quote unquote, like Luther. I have very mixed emotions about Luther. I think he was a very evil man, very weak man, but I can't help but admire his faith in Jesus Christ. I really am inspired by his faith just on his deathbed, holding that crucifix and saying, this is it. This is all we need is faith in Jesus Christ. You're my Lord and Savior. I'm a sinner. Save me. Please save me. I can't help but get the chills. Just now I'm getting the chills thinking about Martin Luther leaning on nothing but his faith in Jesus Christ. I'm getting chills right now thinking about it. So I do admire him.
Yes, and this is specifically what where I disagree with the Most Holy Family Monastery on. They do not believe that someone who is not formally a member of the Roman Catholic Church can be saved. I think that historically, someone who is not formally a member of the Catholic Church can still find their way in the Catholic Church, even if they're not aware of it through their submission to.
Yeah, of course. This is one of my favorite saint is Saint Augustine. And he famously said that we are going to be surprised. Expect the unexpected with God always. So we're going to be surprised when we get to heaven and we see who was in the church that we thought was outside of our visible boundaries and who was outside of the church, even though they appeared to all appearances to be within the Catholic Church. And there are many, many saints throughout the history of the church that talk about the number of damned in the hierarchy of the church. It's shocking. Think about some of these statements by some of these great saints who say most Catholic priests go to hell. That's shocking. It's not an infallible statement. I'm not saying that I believe it. I'm just saying it's a sobering idea. Is it true? I hope not. I hope that saint was wrong. I hope that it was hyperbole. I hope it was God Almighty sending us a little wake-up message. I hope so. Would I be surprised or disappointed when I get to heaven? Yes, I will be disappointed, but in heaven, there's no room for disappointment. So it's only here below that we can have this sort of anxiety over those that are burning in hell. Once we're up in heaven, we don't have anxiety, we don't have sadness, we don't have fear, we don't have any of these things. We don't even have faith in heaven. We only have love.
Yeah, I am open to. I am even open to the idea that I think Bishop Aron proposed about heaven being, quote, overcrowded, right? That sort of idea I'm open to.
I certainly hope so. I mean, when it comes to hell, it's a dogma of the church, so I believe it. And philosophically, just as a thinking person, a rational person with free will, I cannot imagine true religion without eternal consequences. I just can't imagine having morality. For example, if I knew that I was guaranteed to go to heaven no matter what, my behavior would change. I would no longer be striving every moment of every day to live a good life and to die a happy death and go to heaven. I would be indulging in pleasure and sin. I am not a great ascetic. If you watch my lifestyle, you're not going to see someone that's abstaining from all kinds of daily pleasures. I indulge. I'm lazy. I'm a glutton. I'm a glutton with my eyes. If I see a beautiful woman, I'm going to turn. I'm going to look, and then I'll say a little prayer and say, I can't do that. I'm Catholic. So I'm a weak man. But if I believed that I was going to go to heaven, I would indulge even more in my gluttony with food and my gluttony with my eyes and my laziness at work and my selfishness and my self-indulgence. I mean, hell is very essential. But on the other side of that coin, I don't want anyone to be there. I don't want Satan and his demons to be there. But the church has told me that there is absolutely no hope for Satan and his demons. So I accept that reality. It's sad, but that's justice. That's reality. And I mean, I just have to accept it. I don't want anyone to suffer, even a little bit, much less infinitely for all eternity. And I think you are the same, and I think most people are the same, unless they're sick and sadistic.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And again, this was a point. This isn't my argument. You can follow very good Catholic theologians and apologists. Jimmy Akin comes to mind. Tim Staples comes to mind, and of course Joseph Ratzinger, the Pope, formerly Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, to address this point. Yes, I definitely agree. So, do you want to quickly run over the state of Roman Catholicism in Canada before?
Oh boy, I live in Quebec, right? The province of Quebec. Mm-hmm. And I think the numbers are still dropping. If I'm not mistaken, the latest polls. I don't keep up to date, but I've seen someone sent me something recently, and the numbers have been declining since the Révolution Tranquille, as they called it in the 50s and 60s, and the numbers continue to decline. There is a bit of a resurgence from time to time among the youth of Quebec. They want something. They want something traditional. They want religion. They want they want structure. They want morality. They want meaning in their lives. And I think it's the same across Canada. I was born in Ontario, so you're in Ontario. Maybe you can share your perspective. But I was a Protestant. I was born and raised Protestant in Ontario. Then I was an atheist for 25 years, and I only came to Catholicism when I had been living in Quebec for a number of years. Is it a coincidence? Yes, I think it is. But being surrounded by the churches, there's so many churches in Montreal, and the saint names on the streets, like every fourth street has a saint for a name for the street. It can't help but have softened my anti-Catholic fervor, having lived here in Quebec. But maybe you can talk a little bit about your perspective on Canada and Ontario in particular.
So Canadians are not foaming at the mouth anti-Catholics. Like you won't really encounter that. There's more of what some would call liberalism, but the one thing is that my side of Canada, at least, is extremely welcoming. So it would be very unusual for someone to be openly anti-Catholic to you in real life. Now, over the internet, you'll see toxic anti-Catholicism everywhere, but in real life, it is very, very much welcoming, and you won't really encounter any. But as far as importance of it, I mean, there are some, but mostly I would say older people, and to younger people, it's probably something more of a cultural identifier. That's
okay. What do you mean? I'm not sure I understand what you're saying there.
Exactly what part don't you understand?
The cultural part. Are you saying the antagonism or the Catholicism itself?
Oh yeah, the Catholicism would be more of a cultural identifier. This was a family I was raised in, rather than some.
Okay, you're talking about cultural Catholics and how predominant that is, and how rare it is to find someone that's actually on fire for the Catholic faith. Is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but I still think that there is going to eventually be a minor comeback. Often it is for the wrong reasons, but there are good. There are good things, right? I mean, a lot of people, as you mentioned in Quebec, Quebec, they don't want to let go of. They don't all. They're not all good. They don't all support this more rabid anti-religious campaign that they see. Right? Many of them want the church to have some part in their culture, since it has helped shape their identity. And I think that the same awakening has to happen in places like France. I mean, it's not fair, even if you're an atheist, I would argue, to in any way belittle the role of Roman Catholicism. I mean, the entire French state was inseparable from the Catholic Church for at least 15 or 14 centuries. Right? I mean, it's just something. And that's the thing I hope the awakening happens. And I think there's a good number of even non-Catholics who acknowledge that cultural role. But yeah, as far as the religion goes, I think it's important to dialogue with people and to explain your perspective. But actually, Canada might not be the most promising place, but we are still more religious and more pious than many other European places. So I find encouragement in that, at least.
Are you done with the sociological analysis of Canada? Can I ask you a separate question, a different tangent now?
Sure.
Some of your favorite saints, who do you have special devotion to other than the Blessed Virgin Mary, please?
I mean, probably we're talking about extra biblical saints. So my patron would be Saint Sebastian.
Okay.
Saint Ursula, someone I deeply respect. Saint Valentine.
Oh.
Saint Valentine.
Nice.
Yeah, of Rome, I suppose. And these are saints that helped shape. Saint George, of course. How could I forget Saint George?
In England, the famous guy, the dragon fighter guy.
Yes, the quote dragon fighter guy. Yes, but yeah, my patron is Sebastian.
Can you talk a little bit about Saint Ursula? I don't know her story.
Well, there are many variations, but the basic story goes that she was a virgin who was martyred with other fellow virgins devoted to God. And there are several paintings of her actually meeting the Pope, if you want to know the artistic side too. She's a very famous saint in early Catholicism. There was a huge devotion to her at one time.
Speaking of saints and popes, do you believe, as I'm 90% sure, I'll have to check, but I'm 90% sure that canonizations are infallible, meaning that the church cannot err when she canonizes someone formally as a saint. So if that's the case, obviously accept the most recent canonizations of the popes like Saint John Paul II. Can you comment on that? What's your perspective?
My perspective is that I'm open to debate if there are theologians that dispute that, and I'm sure they are. But as of now, I do accept that the canonizations done officially are at least considered to be infallible. And of course, you have to check that too. But I think that has been taught before. But as far as the canonization goes, like there are unofficial canonizations, then that's a different story.
And of course, there are plenty of martyrs throughout history, bloody martyrs, and so you have no argument against that martyrdom. You believe the church, when the church says this person died for their Christian faith, you believe the church in every instance?
I do believe that the church has taken great care to ensure that the saints that are formally canonized are, we know many things about them historically. And yes, even if we don't know the details, for example, there are embellishments. We do know that St. George was actually martyred for his faith. We don't know many details, but we know that. We know that St. Sebastian was martyred too, even if we don't know the other details.
And in terms of the writings of the saints, I'm very moved and touched by, for example, Saint Alphonsus Liguori, Saint Louis Marie de Montfort. I'm moved by the writings of Saint Augustine, my favorite saint. I'm moved by Saint Francis de Sales' writings, Saint Ignatius of Loyola. I'm moved by many saints and their writings. So in terms of their writings, which ones have you enjoyed the most? Which ones inspire you the most, and why?
Probably it would have to be Saint Francis of Assisi's different writings, because as a child I used to read that. I wasn't a Catholic, but I always had the affinity for the books. But I also have to probably remark about this subject. In Catholicism, there has always been the debate about Marian maximalism versus Marian minimalism, right? And I think that the same would apply to the saints. So I'm probably in the camp of not maximalist. So I know Catholics who only talk about the role of Marian maximalism and more maximalism for saints. I am more careful to emphasize that over the Holy Scripture and more established traditions. But I'm open to others being maximalists in that regard.
Yeah, I'm definitely a maximalist by nature, by predisposition.
Not in that I'm not a Marian maximalist. I know people who use the language about Mary that would be very maximalist, and popes have warned against maximalism. I avoid that kind of language and that kind of. For me, I accept the dogmas about Mary. I accept her high role, and I don't accept that she was just a woman, one of many. But as far as maximalism goes, then I'm very careful about that.
I'm eager to give her as much honor as I can within the bounds set by Christ and his church. So if you can send me hard limits on the sort of maximalism that's within bounds, I would appreciate that, because I mean, the strongest language I've heard is that she may not be a god, but I would believe her to be a god if the church had not told me that she's not a god. This is Saint Alphonsus Liguori. And if you read his glories of Mary, if you're not a maximalist, it might make you uncomfortable. Same thing with Saint Louis Marie de Montfort. If you're not a maximalist, you might be a little bit uncomfortable with it. But I love it. Nothing pumps me up more than that.
I definitely I wouldn't say uncomfortable, but for me, I do not. I think there is great care to be taken against that. Again, Pope St. Pius XII himself warned against Marian maximalism, and he is considered the most Marian Pope. So I would caution against Marian maximalism for sure. I've heard language even from popes about Mariology that are pretty hard to hear for someone who is not a maximalist. Like, if I remember correctly, Pope Pius XI, or perhaps it was 10th, saying about us finding refuge in this gulf that is Mary. I would, again, avoid such language because I'm not personally a maximalist myself. I accept all dogmas about Mary, Immaculate Conception, Assumption, all of that. I think it's completely scriptural and biblical to elevate Mary. I mean, if you read Revelation 12, if you read Luke 2 in historical context and read the Gospel of John, it is Mariology becomes more prominent, much more prominent than what others would have us believe. But I am a Marian. I accept just the right things and not anything more. I'm not a Marian maximalist for sure.
Yeah, according to your evaluation, and you accept just the right amount, but I do the same thing. But I guess I'm a maximalist when it comes to honoring the Vicar of Jesus Christ too, and that's probably what made you think that I might be straying into heresy. But I assure you, I'm not. Yeah. And I should apologize for my shocking language. But I do. Part of my, for lack of a better word, part of the thrill of being a Catholic is the seeming absurdity of the humility of God, and I can have the heights of it's intoxicating.
I also had that zeal. I only talked about saints, the popes, the things that distinguished me from other Christians, because that was something I was unused to. It more time has passed. The same thing goes about this ultramontanism, this extreme devotion to the Pope. I again caution against it, and that's again the same line that modern popes have taken. If you check out Pope Benedict XVI, he has again warned against this ultramontanistic devotion to the Pope. Pope Francis has taken even further measures to try and, the whole, and again, you could argue that this wasn't historically so, but I think that even further in history, this is much more consistent. I think the papacy, definitely there is a good argument to be made for the papacy, and a very important office. But from my perspective, this papal maximalism, it's probably something I just invented. Ultramontanism is something that we have to be cautious against.
Yeah, Ultramontanism, if I'm not mistaken, it was formally and explicitly condemned at an ecumenical council, no?
No, I don't think so. No, okay. Ultramontanism and Gallicanism were two positions taken. Ultramontanism was the
reaction.
The devotion to the Pope, whereas the Gallicanism was the idea that the head of state is the one who selects the bishops. Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to diagnosing my ultramontanism, if I have fallen into it, and I've been meaning to look into this, but if I have fallen into it, I'd like to have some sort of diagnostic test. Are there a couple of yes/no questions that you could ask me that would indicate that maybe I am straying into ultramontanism? Just sort of simple multiple choice questions.
Yes, I think that. The first it comes to how do you look at that? I don't see the Pope apart from the Church. I see Pope as part of the Church, and I see the papal office as an elevated office of a hierarch. I don't see it as anything very, very special other than the fact that that's how God chose it to develop. That's just how historically developed. It so happened that Christian orthodoxy that would result in what we call the Catholic Church was formed in Rome. And that's where the bishop's seat happened to be, right? And that's
but let me ask you something. Are you familiar with the four manifestations of infallibility in the Church? Are you familiar with all four?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got papal infallibility when he speaks ex cathedra, and the Church, it's not in any way dependent on the Church, right? And then we have the extraordinary magisterium, which is a general ecumenical council, and then we have the ordinary magisterium, and then we have the sensus fidelium, which is that the entire body cannot err when it agrees in what the faith is. So those are the four manifestations of infallibility. Do you accept all four, or do you think that first one, papal ex cathedra, is subject to debate or nuance?
Yeah, no, again, I accept papal infallibility, but I accept papal infallibility properly. I think papal infallibility has less to do with the character of the Pope and more with the protection of the Pope.
It has nothing to do with the character of the Pope. Nothing. Zero. Nothing.
Yeah, so that's what I accept. I accept that the papal infallibility is there specifically for the reason of the authority that Pope has. Basically, if the Pope were to err on a key issue, the reasoning goes that this would be almost indistinguishable from the church erring, right? So this is why papal infallibility is there, because theologically Pope would have to be protected in these special cases, given that his stamp, him being mistaken on a key issue, the stamp of this would be almost indistinguishable from basically the whole church erring. So I accept papal infallibility for this reason. I think that since the church cannot err, and since Pope weighing in on such a key issue ex cathedra would be indistinguishable from church erring, right? And it follows that if the church is protected from error, in these cases, the Pope too has to be protected. So if that's what it is, I accept papal infallibility that way. I don't think that's ultramontanism at all. It's not something that was merely invented in the 19th century. It's something that had been developing for a long time. But ultramontanism and this papal devotion is, again, when the submission to the Roman Catholic Church is the same as the submission to the Pope. And I don't think so. I still think that the Pope is part of the Catholic Church and not apart from it.
Yeah, but there's a key distinction that you're passing over, which is that the church, the living magisterium of the church, is comprised of the Vicar of Christ and those bishops who teach in union with him. So the sheep in wolves' clothing, the bad bishops who are fighting against Jesus Christ and his church and the doctrines of the church and the tradition of the church, those wolves in sheep's clothing, they are not in union with Pope Francis. Okay, so I'm speaking in terms of essential matters, right? Essential teachings, right? I'm not speaking in terms of things where the Pope has one opinion. The Pope likes tomato soup and the bishop doesn't like tomato soup. That's not essential. Okay. So that's a very important distinction. And one other thing I'd like to say about I don't think I'm an ultramontanist, because I think it's possible, well within the realm of possibility, that Pope Francis is not a good Catholic. I'm willing to admit that, but I give him the benefit of the doubt. I happen to think, I like him. I have good chemistry with him. When I see him on the screen, I watched his documentary on the big screen in the theater. It was only myself and my friend, my non-Catholic friend, in the theater, a huge theater, only two of us watching the Wim Wenders documentary about Pope Francis, but that shows you how popular Pope Francis is in Montreal. But but just to say that I am inspired by the saintliness and the holiness and the sort of the love and the simplicity of Pope Francis, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I wouldn't be that surprised if he's an evil man, and if if he's a bad Catholic and he ends up, God forbid, burning in hell. That would not surprise me. It doesn't take away from the fact that I think he is, for now, the Vicar of Christ until further notice. I mean, the history books will show us if he was the Pope, and maybe within our lifetime we'll see the Church step forward and say he wasn't a Pope. He was not a valid or illicit Pope. But I highly doubt that. I'm 99.999 repeating sure that he's a valid and illicit Pope, and he is therefore the Vicar of Christ. Is he a good man? I think so. If he's not, I mean, that's really none of my business. I just have to pray for him every day. But he might not be a good man. He might not be a good Catholic. He might end up going to hell. That doesn't change. It doesn't. I'm not naive about him as a person, his character. He seems like a nice guy, but I don't say, oh, he's Pope, therefore he must be a nice guy. He must be a good guy. He must be holy. He must be impeccable. No, far from it. But it's the office. It's the office that I respect, and the Church teaches, and Pope Francis lays heavy emphasis on the fact of the dignity of the person. So the example I like to use is the bad popes, like Alexander VI in the Middle Ages. He's an example of a bad pope. I love and respect him, and if I lived during his time, I would have the same attitude toward Alexander VI that I have toward Pope Francis or any of the other popes, even the saint popes. They're all in the same boat. Obviously, those popes who are saints are going to inspire more faith and more fervor. But I give all of them the benefit of the doubt, even if I lived under a bad pope. And if you look at some of the great saints that lived under bad popes, they always revered the Pope and gave respect to the Pope and gave the benefit of the doubt to the Pope. So I don't think that's ultramontanism.
Yeah. So I am grateful for this conversation. I think it was really enjoyable. And
thank you.
Yeah. God bless.
Let's do it again sometime. I really have to thank you for taking the time and for working through. We had some technical issues. I really appreciate your patience. You stood by, you were patient, and patience is a virtue. And I'm going to be, I do enroll all of my guests into the Scalabrini League of the Missionary Fathers of St. Charles Borromeo. So you and your family, which includes your parents living or deceased, any siblings living or deceased, any children you might have, past, present, or future, living or deceased, they will all be benefiting from the infinite graces that come from the sacrifice of the Mass every day until the end of time. Even if you die and go to purgatory, those masses will be said for you until the very end of time, as long as the order exists. So lots of graces coming your way, and in exchange, I'd ask you to pray for me and mine. And I don't come from a very happy situation in terms of Catholicism. I'm the only one to have converted so far, and I would appreciate your prayers for me and for my family and friends and everyone close to me.
Yes, my situation is the same. I'm the only Catholic in my family. Yeah.
So the Lord works in mysterious ways. But thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you too.
God bless.